Hey, what's going on, guys? It's me, Jay, here to do another review. Back for another review. We're doing the third installment of my Christmas review series. And we're doing The Grinch That Stole Christmas, starring Jim Carrey, that was released in the year 2000 and is directed by Ron Howard of, of course, as we know, Andy Griffith fame, as well as Happy Days. So let's get into it. But I want to talk, before I talk about that, a little bit about the origin of the story of the Grinch that stole Christmas. The Grinch that stole Christmas is, of course, from the famous author known as Theodore Seuss Geisel, aka Dr. Seuss. Born in 1904 to German immigrant parents, his upbringing was in the state of Massachusetts, in Springfield, Massachusetts. As a matter of fact, his upbringing was very interesting. His father, being of a German immigrant, both his parents were German immigrants. Of course, starting a brewery, working in a brewery. But, and one of his favorite things to do as a kid was go to the zoo with his family, and he would draw the animals that he saw at the zoo. So his dad, seeing that he had an aptitude for drawing, brought him a drawing pad. Later, the city's mayor appointed Theodore's father as the head of that particular zoo. And it was good he did, because the Geisel family was going to need help, because it was 1918 and the Second Amendment, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, which, yeah, for many people that know American history, the 18th Amendment is the amendment outlawing the consumption and sale of alcohol. Now, during World War One, Geisel's parents and himself were persecuted because, of course, the United States was fighting Germany, so they would call his family German drunks. And it didn't help that his father ran the brewery. Yes, Prohibition. Prohibition was the 18th Amendment. It lasted for several decades, mostly typified in the 20s by the rise of organized crime. It was the 18th Amendment, and it was later overturned by the overturned several amendments later. It's probably the only. It is the only constitutional amendment that has been overturned by yet another constitutional amendment. But this affected Theodore's family, so, and even affected him. He went to Dartmouth College, and while in college, he was actually kicked out for a brief time. He was editor of the school newspaper for working with the cartoons. That's where he earned the name Dr. Seuss. Seuss was his mother's maiden name, right? So he didn't want to go with Geisel, so he just went with Seuss. So he was he was thrown out of the paper because he was caught with his buddies drinking at a time when Prohibition was going on and you weren't allowed to drink. From there, he went to Oxford for a while. After he graduated, he went to Oxford for a while in England, and he started to write for a political. Cool, David. He started to write for a political paper called PM. There, initially, his cartoons were all political, and they would become more political over the decades, especially during World War II, where he worked for the American government as part of their propaganda machine. Because even in the 30s, he was so adamant about the United States getting into the war, right? He was totally against those isolationists, because in the 30s, you had America Firsters as well. You know, just like you have America First now, Nick Fuentes wasn't the originator of America First. There were America Firsters in during World War II as well that objected to the United States um, going into uh, entering into the Second World War before December 7th, 1941, right? And Dr. Seuss was against those guys. Dr. Seuss was writing satirical stuff about the likes of Charles Lindbergh, for example, and really speaking out against the America Firsters because he believed that it was the duty of the United States to enter into the war. But after 1941, of course, everything changed. The United States entered into the war, and Dr. Seuss became part of the propaganda arm of the United States. Another people that were part of that was another person that was part of that was Stan Lee. You know, Stan Lee also joined the army as part of the propaganda arm of the United States, you know, during that conflict. But Dr. Seuss was criticized because, because as being somewhat sympathetic to the Japanese people. But later he released a documentary on Japanese culture that actually earned him an Oscar. And this was in 1945, after the war. After he came back from there and he was done with his political stuff, that's when he really, like, closing into like the late 1940s, early 1950s, was when he really got the ball rolling when it came to children's cartoons. First with Horton Hears a Who, and then later on in 1957 with The Cat in the Hat, and later the book that the movie that the book is based on that we're talking about. Um, yeah, yeah. The Grinch That Stole Christmas. One of Aaron says he was ahead of his time. One of the things that Dr. Seuss emphasized, because even though he wanted to do, and I find this a lot with a lot of these guys we talk about, you know, these creative geniuses, whether it's Vince McMahon, whether it's Jim Henson, whether it's um, George Lucas, whether it's L. Frank Baum, a lot of these guys, when we profiled many of these gentlemen on this channel, a lot of these guys wanted to do other things that didn't involve their particular niche, but they just never were able to break out of it. And Dr. Seuss was very similar because what ended up happening when it came to Dr. Seuss, he did do a couple of movies, right? But they were flops. But what ended up happening with him was that he got in this niche because it was revealed at the time that a lot of kids' literacy rates in the United States were falling at an all-time low. And part of the reason was because and he diagnosed the reason. So they called him a doctor because his dad his dad thought he would get into veterinary science, you know, because he loved animals so much. That's why he took the name Dr. Seuss. But he actually did diagnose something. He said that the reason a lot of kids weren't reading in this country was because books were boring. And his books initially were criticized because a lot of the kids weren't perfect paragons of virtue, uh, like uh, like in other children's stories. You know what I mean? Particularly in like Horton Hears a Who or Cat in the Hat, you know, or his first book published way back in the 1930s. I Heard It on Mulberry Street because his father worked in the brewery on Mulberry Street in Massachusetts. You know what I mean? And that book was about a kid that was very mischievous, right? And had a vivid imagination, and people criticized him for that. You know, but he said that you got to relate to kids on their level. And although he wanted to do more serious stuff, like the Japanese documentary that he did about Japanese culture in 1945, he never really got out of that niche of writing children's books. with easy to understand language. Many of them, I do not like green eggs and ham, red fish, blue, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. Classic books in the 50s and 60s that really helped with American literacy. So that was his biggest achievement. He passed away um, in in the 90s, right? 1990 was his last book that he ever released, right? But what was his inspiration for this story in particular, The Grinch? Well, at this time he was going through a rough patch in his life. His wife was very sick. This was 1957. His wife was sick, and he just wasn't in the Christmas spirit. You know what I mean? So that inspired him to really want to write this book, and eventually would lead to this movie. Now, the animated version was released first, and many people remember the song. He's a Grinch. I'm not going to sing it, but anyway, many people remember the song. And the movie, like I said, directed by Ron Howard. Other people tried out for this role, but Jim Carrey wanted it because, well, he was popular at the time. He had released The Mask. He had released. Jim Carrey had like 3 hits in a row by the time this movie came around. He had Dumb and Dumber. He had Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, and he had The Mask. So he was perfect for this. Other people that tried out for this, though, were Adam Sandler, Eddie Murphy, tried out for this role, but I just can't imagine anybody being being this role other than Jim Carrey. And this movie, although panned by critics, was pretty good to me. Like David said, he saw it when he was a kid in school. And the basic premise of it is that the Grinch, he lives on this hill, right? And he's ostracized by the people of Whoville, right? Because they make fun of him, they tease him. He tries to fit in with them. He tries to even shave himself, but they cut him. And then they invite him to this celebration, and they just embarrass him. And what he's basically attacking when he and his dog go to steal the Christmas ornaments and the Christmas decorations, what the book is basically getting at is a lot of the deeper themes, the commercialization of Christmas, the oversaturation of Christmas, and how many have lost the Christmas spirit. That's what I get from this film, this particular portrayal. And like I said, Jim Carrey was the perfect person for this because he had played characters like the Riddler, that were very similar. To the Grinch. So I love the song. He's a heel, Mr. Grinch. They say in the song, the Grinch is a heel. Which always, as a wrestling fan, it always kind of made me chuckle because I'm like, wow, they know this term, a heel. But obviously it's a term that originated in much more antique language than this. But the film, I prefer the live action version more than the cartoon version, honestly. I mean, many of Dr. Seuss's books rather haven't translated to good movies. To be honest with you, I didn't like Mike Myers' portrayal of Cat in the Hat, but I did like this one. It was different. It was a more darker tone than the book. The persecution and stuff he endures at the hands of the Who's of Whoville is pretty severe in the movie, but I enjoyed it. Ron Howard is a weird director. I never really liked Ron Howard's direction, to be honest with you. I think he fucked up Solo. And never really was a huge fan of him. Maybe in Beautiful Mind, I think he directed that, starring Russell Crowe. But yeah, I definitely give this movie a 5 out of 10. On the halfway point, and I can see why people see it as a classic. Like I said, I enjoy Dr. Seuss's books. I think he was one of the greatest inspirations of our generation. Of the 20th century, the greatest literary minds, because he simplified things so much, and he made reading accessible for kids. Many of the first books we ever read. I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam. I am. He agreed to keep it to less than 50 words, which made his books made them very interesting for children. But anyway, guys, that's all for the Grinch that stole Christmas. Tried to steal Christmas, but I found it interesting how Dr. Seuss, who was a very religious man, he remained a Lutheran throughout his whole life, of the Lutheran faith, but he felt that Christmas was losing its meaning, and that's why he wrote this book. Anyway, guys, thank you, David and Aaron, for contributing. Glad you guys could join us today. And that's all for Dr. Seuss movie. Give it a watch if you can. Peace.